Please join me in building my new gaming computer. The parts in this build was just under $2,200 before shipping, tax, windows, and all my peripherals. This machine is designed to max games out at 1440p 144Hz refresh rate. Let's go. The CPU is none other than the 7800X3D from AMD, the best gaming chip in the world. It has been reported that the 7800X3D will be faster than any of the immediate upcoming 9000 CPUs from AMD. Since this PC will be purely for gaming, this Ryzen is a no-brainer. Obviously, the 9800X3D, when that comes out, should blow this thing out of the water. But I don't want to wait that long for its release. The motherboard we are going with is the MSI MPG Carbon Wi-Fi using the B650 chipset. To be honest, I kind of overspent on this motherboard. This board has overkill power delivery, which I can justify, and it has more than enough expansion for what I need. 4 M.2 slots and a plethora of input-output. I could have bought a tier down, but I love the aesthetic of this board, and I love the MSI Dragon branding. I needed this Dragon in my life again. But that's enough talk. Let's build. Time for the SSD. This MSI SSD heatsink has a thermal pad on the bottom and top of the SSD. For this build, I'm going with Crucial for my SSD. I usually go with Western Digital, but this bad boy was on sale for about $50 cheaper. The speeds are just as good, and Crucial has always been a solid brand for me in the past. It's a Gen 4 drive. Don't need Gen 5 yet for gaming. Not yet. I don't know if you noticed, I never did, but I never took the film off the bottom thermal pad. Rookie mistake. Good thing I caught it early before I installed everything into the case, booted it up. So let's backtrack a bit and fix my mistake. Much better, that's what we like to see. Onto the RAM. G.Skill Ripjaws. This RAM is DDR5 and will run at 6000 MHz. I always choose G.Skill as it's always been stable and I haven't had any issues with RAM in my builds for a few years now. Maybe I've just been lucky. Maybe it's the G.Skill. As far as gaming is concerned, 32 GB of these bad boys will be perfect. Take a look at how I install the RAM. What rating would you give me for how clean of a install it is? I'd give myself a 7.5 out of 10 on that one. It could have been more even as I was pushing down. Now for the case, the beautiful Fractal North XL. Behind the wood bezel is 3 included 140mm fans, which means you won't have to spend extra money on buying your fans, unless you want RGB fans of course, but if you want RGB fans with this case, you're a psychopath. As you can see, the front panel comes with a magnetic dust filter. And as you can see, I struggled taking it off, but I didn't break it. This case sure is gorgeous. Let's take it apart and get building in it. The top of the case can house a 360mm radiator, which is what I'm going to be using. And if you look here, it can house 18cm fans up top. That's crazy. I don't think I've ever seen a case have 180mm fans up top. The back of the case is very basic, but very practical. It has enough holes to stick any cable you may have through, strategic Velcro straps, and this fan hub where the 3 front fans are wired to, making it easy to connect the fans to the motherboard with just a single fan cable. Moving on, we're going to get the PSU prepped to install. To install the PSU, you have to first remove the PSU bracket, which will become fastened to the power supply itself. I'm going with the amazing Seasonic Focus for this build. I actually harvested this 850 watt unit from the previous build that I did on this channel. Rated for 70 amps on the 12 volt rail, this Tonka truck of a PSU will easily handle the hardware that's going into this computer. I always recommend plugging in all your power cables to your PSU before you install the power supply into the computer. You'll do yourself a favor. For the cables, I'll need 3 8-pin PCI Express power cables for my video card. I'm going to use both 8-pin CPU power cables to feed my CPU, and of course I'll need the 24-pin motherboard cable. Normally with my builds, I have stuff that requires a SATA power cable, but I won't need one for this build. Sometimes the cable connections are stubborn and finicky, so just make sure they're all plugged in tight. Next, we'll install the PSU bracket to the power supply. For that, we'll need some screws that came in the Fractal accessory box. Not gonna lie, this accessory box is pitiful if I say so myself. Grab a hold of some power supply screws and start screwing. Once we're all nice and screwed, let's get that PSU installed into the case. Alright, let's get that motherboard on the standoffs. The Fractal case comes with pre-installed standoffs for an ATX motherboard. Let's line it all up nice to the standoffs and screw it to the case with the included screws that came with the case. Let's plug the power cables into where they need to go on the motherboard. I always start with the 8-pin CPU power cables. It's always easier to get these plugged in before I install the CPU cooler. In this case, I'm using a 360mm radiator. So by installing these first, it gives me a lot more room to work with. Alright, before we keep plugging in power cables, and before the case gets too cluttered, let's plug in the front panel connections, starting with the dreaded power switch and activity light. These are the front panel USB connections. This is a USB-A, and the other one's USB-C. And this is the motherboard 24-pin power. I usually find that this connection is the most stubborn, so just make sure it's actually connected. This is the front fans that we talked about earlier. I'm just going to plug it into a fan header. And this is the front panel audio connection. I normally never plug this in because I just run my audio out the back of my computer. But if you want to plug your headphones into the front of your case, you'll have to plug this in. Like I said, I normally don't do this, but for the sake of the video, I'll plug it in. Let's tackle the all-in-one cooler that we're using. This is the EVGA CLCx cooler, which has a 360mm radiator. I normally find the cooler, especially if you're using an all-in-one liquid cooler, to be the most complicated part of any build. I chose this all-in-one because I used the previous generation of this cooler in a previous build and I loved it. The EVGA software to control the pump, fans, RGB, etc. is in my opinion the best in the game. Also, I think EVGA is an awesome company. I love them and I'll continue to support them as long as they're around and as long as they don't engage in any shady business practices. Our cooler isn't designed to use the mounting hardware that comes stock with the motherboard, so we'll have to install the mounting hardware that came with the all-in-one cooler. Coolers come with different sets of mounting hardware depending on what CPU you're using. Since the 7800X3D uses AM5, I'll have to make sure I'm using the proper AM5 hardware and orientation. Next, we'll have to prep the cold plate with the proper mounting hardware as well. Note, this cold plate has pre-applied thermal paste. Some coolers don't and you have to apply thermal paste yourself. Once the proper AM5 hardware is on, we can join the cold plate with the CPU and tighten the screws. Don't over tighten with the screwdriver if you're going to use one. Get the screws hand tight and then use the screwdriver to just snug it up. This cooler communicates with the system through this top LCD cover. All the data and power gets connected to it. Let's get it onto the cold plate. We'll plug all the cables into where they need to go in a bit. But first, let's get this radiator installed to the top of the case. A good thing about working in a case that's large like the Fractal North XL is that there's a lot of room up top to run cables after the top radiator's been installed. So let's start connecting everything. Let's start with the fans. All three of these fans on the radiator will just plug into one adapter, and that adapter gets plugged into the LCD plate on the cooler. Now, you'll see me here making a mistake. I plugged the adapter for all three fans into the motherboard. This is fine, you can control it with motherboard software if you'd like, but I'd rather control it with the software that comes with my EVGA cooler. Now these fans on this cooler do have RGB on them. I'm not going to be using the RGB, I'll just have it turned off, but I'll plug it in anyways just to show you. So all three fans have an RGB cable and they all just connect together, and then that just gets connected into the controller on the LCD plate. This cooler also requires a SATA power cable from the PSU to power it, which I never installed because I didn't think I'd need it. Big mistake. So now I have to plug a SATA cable into my PSU so I can use it, which sucks because this PSU is already installed. This is a USB cable from the cooler, which I'll need to plug into the USB header on my motherboard. Oh yeah, the big kahuna. This is the XFX 7900 XTX. I was either going to go with this or an RTX 4080 Super. I'd say the 4080 Super is better overall, but I want to try out AMD as I haven't had an AMD card in my primary gaming computer since my very first build back in 2009, which was a 4870 for all you OGs out there. This XFX card also comes with a neat support bar with it. Alright, now that the card's in place, let's run the 3 8-pin PCI Express power cables and plug them into the card. Alright, let's get this thing put all back together. The Fractal North XL is a great case to build in. There's a lot of room to work with inside of the case, and all the cable management features made this build seem almost too easy. I didn't run into a single problem with it. Fractal has been around for a while and refined their case design, and it shows when you're building in it. The aesthetics and finishing touches of the case are top notch, and when it comes to integrating a wood bezel into a computer case, I don't think any other manufacturer will be able to make it as good as this Fractal, but I guess time will tell with that. Well boys, it's time to spool this puppy up.